then I'll hit the start button.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. We're back again. This time I'm with Brandie Longoria, and Brandie is a teacher, speaker, tutor, and she is also an accredited instructor of language and writing. So welcome, Brandie. I'm going to let you just go for it, and I'll listen for you. When you feel like you're winding down, I'll pop back in and we'll chat a bit. Okay?
All right. Thank you, Cynthia, very
You're
much.
quite welcome.
And welcome out there in Zoom world. I appreciate you attending our session on how to teach your children to write. And if you have, one of the things I love to talk about is your specific situation. So if you are new to homeschooling, or if you have an older student or a younger student, if you just want to pop that up in the chat box, and I might be able to address some more specific situations to your needs. In absence of that, I'm going to go through a talk that I often do, and it's called the why, what, and how of teaching your children to write. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see my slides, and so that we can go through this together. All right, there we go. Okay, so all right, so why do we teach our students to write? And when I talk about writing, I'm not talking about penmanship. I'm talking about composition. So penmanship and composition are very different skills, and they're in different parts of the brain. You have your composition part, which is the getting your thoughts from your head down to the computer, versus your penmanship, versus spelling, versus grammar. They all take part in different parts of the brain. So what I'm going to be referring to today is the art and skill of composition. But why? Why do we teach composition? And one of my writing mentors that I'm a huge fan of, his name is Andrew Pudwa. He told me something one time, and he says it in one of his seminars. He says, a good idea poorly presented is not necessarily as effective as a good idea, as a bad idea presented well. Let me say that again. A good idea presented poorly is not necessarily as effective as a bad idea presented well. And, all we have to do really is look around at our world and our country today, at the factions and the fighting and the rhetoric that we hear going on, to know that good ideas and bad ideas sometimes is very difficult to tell the difference between them, but nothing is particularly persuasive but if somebody comes and speaks persuasively or writes persuasively, we are more apt to believe them. So this is why we teach composition. Now, you heard me say the word rhetoric. This is a very important point, and I want to get through this. Oftentimes when we hear the word rhetoric, we have negative connotations of it. Typically, it is associated with the talking heads on the news programs or of politicians. Rhetoric simply means it is the art and skill of persuasion. So this is definitely something that we need, and we need our students to learn it. It actually goes all the way back to Socrates, and his student Aristotle wrote down, or what they call canonized, certain aspects of rhetoric. And I would like to go through that with you briefly so that you understand not only what I'm talking about when I say rhetoric, but why we teach this and how we teach this through writing. The skill of writing is probably the best form of rhetoric training that we have available to us today. All right, so the canons, or pillars, rules of rhetoric, there are 5 of them. The first one is called invention. Now you might say, oh yeah, invention, coming up with something to say. That sounds normal. But we actually get the word from the the Latin word inventio, which means to come upon or discover or to devise or find out. It's where we get our English word inventory from. So invention isn't only coming up with something brand new that nobody has ever thought of before. It's also coming up with what we already know, if that makes sense. So invention is the first canon of rhetoric. The second canon of rhetoric is what we call arrangement. This we get from the Latin word, let me see if I can say it, despacito. It's not Spanish, it's not the song. And it's where we get our English word disposition, or if you translate it, it means arrangement or order. Our to-do lists, our priorities, things that we have that are important to us, we put in list of order. When you are writing, you also need to put your thoughts onto paper in an organized fashion, and that is under the rhetorical canon of, in English we call it arrangement. All right, and the third one, the third canon of rhetoric is called style. In English we call it, excuse me, my tongue is tied, we call it style. Elocution is another word that we get, and it comes from the Latin again, and it means style. It means persuasive words, literary devices, similes, metaphors, the words that we use, the specific word choices that we have. These three canons of rhetoric are the three canons that we deal with mostly in teaching our children composition. Now, the fourth canon of composition is memory. You see 4 memory and 5 delivery on there. Memory, or memoria in Latin, doesn't just deal with memorizing the speech. It deals with furnishing the mind. It has the idea of furnishing the mind. Just like you would furnish a house with nice furniture, you want to furnish your mind with good quality basics and foundations for which to draw out your arrangement and style and invention. And the last one is delivery. You have seen people deliver speeches where or talks of any kind, where they're just sitting there. You can't see anything. They aren't moving. It's really boring, especially if they start talking in a monotone voice, kind of like this. You might start to fall asleep, right? All of that is part of delivery. Smiles, eye contact, hands. I talk with my hands. The way that someone physically delivers a speech. So all 5 of those are the 5 canons of rhetoric, and those are, we deal with all of those when we're teaching composition to students, but really the first 3 are the written component of the canons of rhetoric, and that's what we deal with more than anything else. All right, so you might wonder, well then, what are the problems a writer faces? There are 3 main problems a writer faces, and I bet you can't imagine what those are. They happen to be invention, thinking of what to say, coming up with what to say. This is the blank page problem that the students have. The story prompts that says, write a creative story about the 1800s. And you're given a blank page. What do I do? Okay. The arrangement, putting it all in a logical order. And if you notice, I don't know if you attend church. If you do, your pastor does this every Sunday. They think of what to say, they invent their sermon, think of what to say, draw on resources, they do some research, they draw on resources, bring in quotes and that kind of thing, or stories. Arrangement, they put it in a logical order, usually 3 points. I tease my pastor all the time about his 3-point sermons. But Socrates found out that is the most effective. You give 3 points. You tell them what you're going to tell them. You tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. It is a beautiful way that our human brain works. So your pastor will put it in a logical, specific order. And then, of course, elocution. What kind of words am I going to say? How am I going to draw the reader into either the story or, again, a pastor's sermon? Is he going to have any anecdotes in the sermon, any quotes from a famous author that he's been reading, Bible verses, right? And thinking of parallelism is something that is often used, again, in sermons. You know, if you're 3 points, you have the 3 Ps. And so that is a fantastic example of the 5 canons of rhetoric, because they memorize their sermon, or close to memorize, are very familiar with it, and then they deliver it. So I think that is a fabulous example of the 5 canons of rhetoric. But these are the 3 basic problems that a writer faces. So this is what we teach. We teach them how to come up with what to say. We teach them how to put it in order, and we teach them how to use persuasive languages and literary devices to put all of that together. Okay. So how on earth do we do this? Okay. Now, again, I don't know if your children are younger or older. It can look a little bit different depending on the age range of your students. If you're younger, clearly you're going to be using some simpler techniques. If you're older, middle school or high school, you're going to be using something probably a little bit more, I don't want to say complicated, but a little bit more advanced. Okay. Okay. So here are some things to consider as far as how to teach your children to write. Okay. First of all, remember that the process is more important than the product. Learning how to write well is a skill. It is not content driven. You can use it with any content that you are teaching, whether you are homeschooling all at home, homeschooling as part of a hybrid, or going to a private school, or however you're going to school your child or educate your child at home. You can use these skills with anything that you are doing, with any subject, whether it be language arts, whether it be history, whether it be science. Okay, you can use this with anything. So the process, though, is more important than the product. Okay, all children are different. I know that this sounds obvious. We have heard this before. All children are different. But I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about a little bit later, how kids are a little bit different. And I'm going to go over all of these points in a little bit more detail. College and career readiness aren't necessarily the end goal. When we're educating our children, there is a tendency to bow down to the god of the SATs, if you will, or bow down to the god of the College Board. And while I consider college education important, it is not the end goal. The end goal of home educating your children, that may vary from family to family. We all have a reason why we started homeschooling. I started homeschooling a very long time ago, probably 1997. I started researching even before my first was born. My oldest is now almost 22, and I graduated her from high school in 2017. And so my reasons for homeschooling have changed a little bit, but my main reason for homeschooling when they were little was that I wanted to be the main spiritual influence in my children's life. I didn't want to farm them out to teachers, if you will. And while my mission for homeschooling has evolved a little bit over the years, that primary goal has stayed the same: to have a relationship with my children, to have a spiritual relationship with my children, and to be the most important influence, or not most important, but the biggest influence in my children's lives. So I say that to say that college and career readiness was never one of my goals in homeschooling. Yes, I want them to be able to go to college. Most colleges are actually recruiting homeschoolers now, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more. All right. Another goal to go through is teach a method, not madness. And I am going to go into that a little bit more. We don't want chaos when we're teaching writing, jumping around from curriculum to curriculum. You can create your own curriculum or you can follow a method. I prefer some particular methods over others, but you need to find something that works for you and stick with it. All right, but keep it simple. You definitely want to keep it simple. You don't want to make something so difficult that you lose the joy in it. And I'm also going to go over briefly 4 deadly errors of teaching writing to your children. All right, so real quickly, the process is more important than the product. Okay, and again, I was talking about this. You want to teach skills, not content. My writing mentor started life as an adult as a violin teacher. And I think that the world could be saved if we all homeschooled our children the way music teachers teach their student. It doesn't matter when you start, and you don't have to keep up with anyone else. As long as you are progressing and improving, you are doing well. Right? It's a skill. Your teacher, your music teacher, teaches you a skill, how to play B-flat scale, for instance, and you practice that until you master it, and then your teacher gives you something else to add on top of that. Teaching writing is no different. We start with the skill, the basic skill. Once you master that skill, then we add something onto it. All right, so you teach the skills, not content. They practice, you coach them, refine them a little bit, until it's natural and easy for them. Okay, so that's what this is. You teach the skill, you let them practice, you refine that, and they practice again. And that's how all skills, sports are the same way. One of my daughters plays soccer, and she can go out there and think that she's the best player in the world, but if a coach doesn't teach her the skills and she practices them, that's not going to do her any good in the game. But if she goes and she practices those skills over and over again, once it comes time to playing in the game, it'll be natural and easy for her. So again, teaching writing is no different. They will write stupid things. That's okay, especially when they're younger. That's okay. I teach high school language arts, English at a homeschool hybrid program. Even my homeschoolers write stupid things. And that's okay because we're teaching the skills, we're not teaching the content. I am having them practice the skills of persuasive writing. And as they practice that with quality content included in there, they will start to write. I don't want to use the word better, but that's the only word that they write more succinctly. They write more persuasively. It's just not as painful to read as they practice. Okay. So all children are different. Again, we know this. We know that all children are different. Every learner is different. That is an inconvenient fact in our modern educational system, that all children are different, because institutionalized schools, whether it be public or private, are all geared towards the average, the middle of the road student, right? Now, you've probably heard of these 3 main learning styles: auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, okay? First, I just want to review real quickly a couple of different things. If you aren't sure what learning style your children learns by, this might be a good check for you. Okay, visual learners are very, very visual in nature. They love sights, colors, scenes. They learn best by watching a teacher write an example on the board, seeing a demonstration, looking at images, watching videos, or reading a book. All right, when studying for a test, they may need to review their notes or review pictures. They can typically study in a noisy place, and background noise doesn't bother them. I'm a very visual learner, and I can tune out all of that extra noise if I'm reading something very engaging. Okay. An auditory learner, on the other hand, cannot study in a noisy place. They need quiet. Sometimes they can learn with soft, like classical music in the background. We have made a rule in our house when my children are studying something like mathematics, they can listen to some music, but they cannot listen to music with lyrics because it pulls away their attention. So anything that pulls away an auditory learner's attention is going to be obviously negative in terms of retaining information. They rely on sounds and explanations. They prefer to listen to something in an audiobook. Typically, auditory learners typically struggle with learning how to read because they're not very visual. So those phonics rules just don't make sense to them initially. With lots of practice, that can be helped. One of the best things that you can do for if you suspect that your child is auditory, is let them listen to music, or if there's something that you want them to learn, especially if they're younger, do it in a song, right? History information, even mathematical information. If you Google or go on YouTube and look for math facts in song, those are great ways to help those auditory learners. And then there's everybody's favorite, the kinesthetic learner. The kinesthetic learner doesn't necessarily have to be that child who can't sit still. Often is. If your child cannot sit still, they're clearly kinesthetic. It is very stereotypical to say, but generally speaking, young boys are almost all kinesthetic, and young children are all kinesthetic. Oftentimes, we will have combinations of all three. Typically, we have a dominant one. That dominant learning style usually won't appear until they're about 6 or so, 6 or 8. And so before then, it's good to hit all three. First you want to identify what kind of learning style you think your student has, and then you can Google different ways that you can help. An auditory learner, like I said, needs to have things orally. Read to them orally. You can read out loud to them. That's actually for all reading style, or for all learning styles, that's the best thing that you can do for young children, is read, 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 read to them. Even as they become teenagers, continue to read to them, because you are furnishing their mind. Remember that memoria, furnishing their mind with beautiful quality literature, as well as reinforcing that auditory learner. Kinesthetic, you can, for young children, anything with movement. I love yoga balls for learning information. Visual learners, oops, I have my notes here. Okay, visual learners, they can look at model papers. This specifically for literature and composition. They can look at model paper sample papers and essays and paragraphs and sentences. They can list important items that they need. I love to give my children checklists of everything that they need to include in their paper. You can break their papers into parts so that they can separate them visually. Keep a checklist nearby. Like I said, give your eyes a break. Okay. Computers are great for visual learners because it's something that they can look at, something that they can see. Okay. Auditory learners, read the assignment out loud to them. Okay. Or have them read it out loud to you. You can talk about the assignment, especially middle schoolers. Middle schoolers, they need to talk about everything. They just need to talk about everything. So middle schoolers are great for that. Read out loud, outline. They can read their outline out loud to you, or you can, go back and forth. They need to learn how to ask themselves questions. Okay, what does this essay prompt mean? And they need to process out loud. You've seen people that talk to themselves a lot. Oftentimes those are auditory processors and auditory learners. Okay, for your kinesthetic learners, write down ideas and information. Okay, that doesn't mean that children have to sit in a seat, especially if they're kinesthetic. Let them stand. If you get them a taller desk, they sell those computer stands that you can actually raise. Uh, that's great for kinesthetic learners. For younger students, actually, I have two of my students two of my own children tend to be kinesthetic. So we get those bungee cords and we wrap them around the kitchen chairs, and so they can bounce their feet. That's a really good way for kinesthetic learners, especially the younger ones. And they haven't been able to develop that self-control and that self-restraint yet. So that's a really good way to focus that energy out of their body by doing something like that. Involve your body in the thought process. So my main learning styles are primarily visual and secondary. I'm very kinesthetic. So when I'm memorizing something, I need to walk. I pace the house. My children tease me all the time when I'm on the phone. I'm constantly pacing. I am never still when I'm on the phone. And it's the same thing when I'm memorizing an essay or a speech to give. And there's actually mnemonic devices that can help. They're not mnemonic, I'm not thinking of the word right now, where you associate a certain place in your home with a specific part of your essay. You can use a computer, that tactile writing down, or that tactile ability for a computer. Take frequent breaks with some physical activity. So those are some ways that you can help your kinesthetic learner in terms of writing. Okay, now I talked about the 3 learning styles. There are also 3 stages of learning, different ways. We are all in these 3 stages of learning throughout our adult life. If I am and this is going back to what they call classical education. Again, Socrates, Aristotle. This has been going on for thousands of years. I prefer to pay attention to what they say. The beginning stages of learning is called the grammar stage. It's when we can memorize things easily. If I were to want to learn how to sew for the first time, I would have to know the parts of a sewing machine. I would have to know what the needle does, how it goes in, how to put the thread in. Before I can ever actually sew, I need to know what the foot pedal does. I need to know the wheel that I can put the needle in the thread. I need to know how the bobbin works. I need to know what a bobbin is. I need to know what kind of thread for what kind of fabric. That is what we call the grammar stage of learning. Dialectic stage is when you have mastered the grammar and you're starting to put connections together, starting to put the pieces together. This is when you're practicing, okay? Practicing for somebody like me, if I were learning how to sew, would be making easy. I start with an easy garment, maybe like a pencil skirt, or even easier, a circle skirt. Right, doing hems, straight lines. Oh, I've been trying to sew for years. I still can't sew a straight line. Practicing hemming, and then once I get more accomplished, then we go into the stage of learning called rhetorical, meaning I can teach somebody else how to do it. All right, now those are the 3 stages of learning. They also happen to correlate with 3 general age stages in students. Students in early to mid elementary, or late elementary really, are in what we call the grammar stage of learning. And a great example of this is when the movie Frozen came out. My children, well, some of my children were young. They had never seen the movie. I was still in my kind of, I don't want to say anti-Disney mode, but I believed for a while that I couldn't show my kids anything Disney. That was just where I was at that time. And so my students hadn't, excuse me, I say students, my children hadn't seen Frozen yet. Well, my children's friends had seen it and they had the soundtrack. They played the soundtrack twice for my children. My son, who I think was 10 at the time, was out in the front yard just singing at the top of his mind, at the top of his voice, let it go, let it go. And he had never seen the movie, but he knew the song. It's because when you are in the grammar stage of learning, you learn things easily, much more easily than myself, who's almost 50 years old. And then once they hit around, the ages are a little fuzzy, But usually once they turn around middle school, then they enter what we call the dialectic phase, which again is putting connections together. The biggest way you can know if your child is in this phase is when they ask why for everything. If you tell them to do something and they say, but why? Oh, you have entered the blessed time of dialectic learning. And that's when they're making connections, though. For instance, here's a good example. I learned in school about the Trojan War. I also learned as a new Christian about the Book of Ruth. I had no idea that those two were connected not only in time but in space. If you look at a map, they're really not that far from each other. Not only that, but they happened at around the same time period. And for me, I was like, oh, mind blown. Another really good example, in school, I learned about the American Revolution. I also learned about Mozart. I had no idea that they were that they were contemporary of each other. I was like, Mozart was a contemporary thereabouts of the American Revolution. I couldn't believe it. Because I learned them as separate and distinct facts. But once I started putting things together, I was like, oh, the world just opened up to me. It was absolutely fabulous. So then once students enter into high school, that's when they start to move into the rhetorical phase of learning. And you can see this beautifully. As freshmen, they're kind of unsure. They're still a little bit in that dialectic phase of putting things together. But as they grow and as they mature, then they can start to teach others and mentor others and be able to tell you back what they have learned. And if you'll notice, they start teaching you about the technology, because all of a sudden you're old, you don't know anything, and they start teaching you about it. That's a good example of the rhetorical stage. All right, let me get back to my notes here. Okay. All right, and last but not least, you may not be the same learning style as your students, and that's okay. Our teaching style is going to be our own predominant learning style. So again, I'm auditory and kinesthetic. So I am a perfect classroom teacher because that is what most institutional schools, not kinesthetic, but visual, that's what most institutional schools gear towards, is the primary visual, secondary auditory. And so I enjoy surrounding myself with visual cues and posters and teachery things and that kind of thing. But you should probably find out where your child is, what kind of a learner they are, and where they are in terms of the stage of learning in order to be able to gear or personalize, customize a writing program for your children, which is why I brought all of that up to begin with. Okay. So college and career readiness aren't necessarily the goal. Okay, it's not bad, but it's not necessarily the goal. We want them to be independent and critical thinkers, right? I mean, why do we teach them to tie their shoes? Why do we teach them to potty train? Why do we teach them how to eat by themselves? It's because we want them to be independent. We don't want to be their slaves or their maids for the rest of their lives, right? And we want them to be able to be critical thinkers. Otherwise, if they do go to college and they aren't able to think critically, they're going to be duped by more than likely the English professor on college campus. English professors have the reputation of, well, I don't want to get in trouble, but English professors are the ones that typically have the reputations for being the most progressive, if you will, okay? And they have an agenda. All teachers have an agenda, but English college professors have a very distinct agenda. So if your children cannot be critical thinkers, they will be duped by any professor that has that kind of agenda, okay? That we want them to know what they believe and why, right? If a child cannot articulate, if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, if your child cannot articulate their faith and be able to defend it by the time they're 13, let me repeat that. If your child cannot articulate and defend their faith by the time they are 13, mom, dad, you may be in trouble and you need to work on that. It used to be thought that they needed to be able to do that by the end of high school. That's no longer the case. 13. Now, does that mean if your child is over the age of 13 and they can't do that, then they're gone? No, but you need to be aware of that and you need to be intentional about that. Um, all right. And we want them to point others towards truth, beauty, and goodness. And this is really what home education, what homeschooling in general is all about. It's really about training the soul. And you may ask, what has this got to do with composition? But composition, teaching them how to write, is really soul training. That's really what it is. And it's one of the most important things we can do, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited about composition. And I love history. I love science. I love art. I was raised by a professional artist. I love all of I love music. I'm a lifelong musician. I love all of these things, but I don't teach those because I believe teaching composition, teaching writing is one of the most effective tools for this soul training, shall we say. Okay. So teach a method and not madness, excuse me. So I want you to think of Legos. When a child starts playing with Legos, it could be boys or girls. Typically, historically, it's been boys, but I have 3 girls and 1 boy. And most of my girls have loved Legos just as much as my son. When you start your child playing with Legos, and I'm not talking about Duplos, I'm talking about Legos. Typically, you get them an easy kit to put together with instructions. If you were to plop them down in a Lego build station, for instance, the homeschool expos around the country that are still meeting in person, oftentimes they have like a Lego building station. If you were to just dump your 3 or 4-year-old into that kind of situation, they'd probably be overwhelmed and they wouldn't know what to do. They might even be sitting in the corner going, ah, right? Building blocks of structure. You start simple. You start with a simple kit with instructions. You might build with them, right? Now, as they learn to imitate and practice what you do, you can teach them through that imitation and practice. Here, Johnny, put these 3 blocks together. Or Sally, make this kind of a structure for the bottom. Use these pieces and make this kind of a structure. They can learn through that imitation and practice. Again, it goes back to teaching that skill, how to build more complex structures. Okay, first you want to build confidence and then you build variety. All right, and with their own confidence comes their own variety as well. So you can teach a formula, if you will. Some people don't like formulaic writing, but if you don't have a formula, you cannot have a variety. You need a formula first before you can vary from that formula. The 5-paragraph essay is the most typical formulaic writing that you can teach for older students. You don't do that for fourth graders, at least not right away. Eventually they can get there, but you don't start off with that, I guess is what I'm saying. Okay. So we begin with the foundational building blocks. Let the student imitate and practice those skills. Once they master that, then we move on to the next level. Let them practice and correct them as needed. Okay, so that's how we teach writing, is by teaching Legos. All right, now to keep it simple, I cannot emphasize that enough. Just like your baby learned to walk and talk by imitating you, so they must learn to write by imitating models of good writing and hearing models of good writing, reading models of good writing. There is a lot of what I call twaddle out there in reading and writing. Let your children experience good writing. Doesn't all have to be Dickens, doesn't have to be Shakespeare. There are good readings, excuse me. There are talented authors that write really well, for young students as well. Don't get stuck or bogged down in a particular spot, okay? If you need to back off, then back off. Love of your child. Hold on, imitation is good. Let me catch up with my notes. Keep progressing. Don't get stuck and bogged down. Just keep moving through the curriculum that you choose. And love is a key. You need to teach your child not only that you love them, but they can love writing. And I want to share very quickly my story so that you understand this. I barely passed high school English. I am not a traditionally educated teacher. I don't have a teaching certificate. I started to teach writing and I struggled. My early years of homeschooling, I really struggled. I wish I'd known then what I know now. But I struggled because I kept hopping from curriculum to curriculum because I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't understand that I was looking for a method, right? Something that would take me from point A to point B. I said, oh, that looks like fun. Oh, that looks like fun. Oh, that looks like fun, right? And it wasn't until a friend came alongside me and asked me to start teaching a particular writing method that I began to understand that there were specific building blocks to teach, if you will. I also was terrified of grammar, and this person wanted me to help her by teaching some students grammar. And I'm thinking, so I started in the fall of 2012, and my mentor at that time told me something I'll never forget. She said, grammar should be fun. And if it's not fun, you're doing it wrong. So I kind of took that bull by the horns, if you will. And so 8 years later, I realized that grammar, diagramming, oh my gosh, diagramming is so much stinking fun, I am telling you. And I try to teach to my students that it's fun. And so I have had students just falling over themselves, raising their hands, going, oh, me. You know, they want to come up and they want to diagram. And so I've been able to help them learn that it's fun. So love is the key, not only love for your student, but realizing that you can love what you're doing. You can love writing. You can, if you can love grammar, you can love writing, right? I mean, if you can love grammar, you can love anything. And I say that in all jest. I really do enjoy the beauty of our language. The English language is one of the most incredible languages. To go and look at the Latin and the Greek and the Germanic and the Nordic that has contributed to our English language is absolutely incredible. And I will say on top of that, it does make sense. It actually does make sense. There are rules in place that actually make sense, but it is helpful to learn a little bit about the Latin and the Greek roots. If you learn a little bit about those, the phonics rules, all of a sudden, oh, that's why it's spelled that way. Oh, that's why it's spelled that way. It's actually really eye-opening and revealing. So keep it simple. Okay, and last but not least, the 4 deadly errors of teaching writing. You want to avoid these at all costs. I got these 4 errors from Andrew Pudewa, the Institute for Excellence in Writing. This is actually a talk, an entire talk that he does. So I'm just borrowing it from him. And so I didn't want you to think that I came up with it all by myself, okay? The first one is overcorrecting. It's perhaps the most common and dangerous mistake we can teach in writing, teach our students to write, especially for the elementary and intermediate levels, middle school, all right? You may have an experience if you attended public school of the dreaded red pen. First of all, get rid of that red pen. Get rid of the red pen. I never correct my students and my children or my students in red pen. Now, it may just be because of my own association with red pen. Some of my students that I teach have no idea what I'm talking about when I say, it's the red pen. I usually choose green or blue or some purple, something fun. And then it becomes not quite as scary. think of editing rather than correcting when you're talking about composition. Okay, every good writer needs an editor. And I always tell my students this, and I tell their parents this, every good writer needs an editor. Not my favorite author, but one of the most famous, Stephen King. He has a team of 7 editors, and every manuscript that he writes goes through, he said one time, 40 edits. Okay? Every good writer, every author has a team of editors, and every student needs at least an editor. So if you want to be the editor for your child, if you have a relationship with your child, especially if they're younger, you can just insert yourself and be the editor. But just don't overcorrect. Don't correct for everything all at once. Pick one thing and look for that at a time. So the student is also going to have to understand that there is no such thing as a first and final draft. There are many drafts, and that's just something that there are probably 3 or 4 drafts for every writing, and for every essay, every paper, everything that they write, and that's okay. It's just part of the writing process. And then they aren't as attached to it emotionally, and it becomes a little bit easier. Okay, so overcorrecting is the first deadly error. The second one is holding back help. Some teachers and parents think, oh, it has to be their original idea. It can't be anything from my mind into their paper. Well, that is just wrong. It is a lie. There is nothing new under the sun. There is nothing new. There are no new original ideas. If there were, and everything had to be original, Disney would be in so much trouble, right? Because everything that they do is inspired by something else. So holding back help, even up until high school, is something that can be very deadly and steal the joy both from you and from your student. Now, does that mean that you're writing your high schoolers' essays? No, of course not. But you can be a spelling help. You can be a walking dictionary. How do you spell this? You know, you can do that. Let us not forget our purpose and our goal is to teach and model for them. So you need to model for them so that they can develop confidence and fluency. Okay. The next one is unclear assignments. This one is a frustrating one for me as an English teacher. Not only do I homeschool my students, but I teach English at a hybrid school. My own children, two of my children are high school age. And so, you know, they qualify for my classes. My youngest is in middle school. And other teachers have given my students from time to time something like, write an essay on how this makes you feel. Now make sure that your paragraphs are well organized and that you cover the subject thoroughly. That is so frustrating. That is so difficult and frustrating for a student. How on earth do you even begin to do that, especially if they are a beginning to intermediate writer? It's what we call a vague or unclear assignment. Yet, if you have, let me give you an example here. A vague assignment might be, write a 3-page story set in the 1800s. Be sure to add plenty of descriptive words or something like that. That's very difficult. Or how would you like an assignment like this? This would be more preferable. Okay. Write a 6-paragraph story set in the 1800s. It could be in the Old West, the South during the Civil War, or a foreign country. The first paragraph should describe the setting. The second should introduce one or more of the characters. In the third, create a problem for one of the characters using paragraphs 4 and 5 to help them solve the problem. The last should give a little bit of an epilogue and a hint at a message or moral. Each paragraph should have the following stylistic techniques, and then you list out what their stylistic techniques are. Now, I hope that that second assignment seems really clear and kind of like, oh, I can do that. I can do that. Does that make sense? So unclear assignments is, again, one of the deadly errors that will steal the joy from your students and probably from you as a homeschool parent. And the last is over expectation. You cannot, and this kind of goes back to the overcorrecting, you cannot expect them to, especially if they are beginning students, you cannot expect them to get all of their grammar, all of their spelling, all of their stylistic techniques, and everything in the first draft. That's just not fair, especially the younger students. So again, we build on building blocks. We do it step by step by step. We make it easy. Just take that next step. And we teach them little by little by little. Okay, so we don't want to sabotage the progress that we have made with our students. This, at the end, is my very favorite quote. For the sole true end of education simply is this: to teach men and women how to learn for themselves, and whatever instruction fails to do this is effort spent in vain. We want our children, and this also goes back to college readiness as well, rather than have them be ready for college, how about teaching them how to learn their entire life with excitement and joy and want to learn their entire life? Our magnum opus then is to prepare our children to lead in times of peace, but even more in times of crisis. I believe that our country right now is in a little bit of a crisis with all of the chaos and anger and vitriol and hate that is spewing forth on social media. I think that is truly the best example that we have of why we teach our children how to write, because social media has taken a generation of people that have learned no self-restraint, and even friends that have learned self-restraint. I'm just sorry, I don't want to get on a soapbox about social media, but needless to say, it provides an excellent example of why we need to teach our children the need to see truth, beauty, and goodness, and to proclaim truth, beauty, and goodness, and to show truth, beauty, and goodness to the world, and to shout it from the rooftops. And if we can teach them how to learn for themselves and to learn their whole life long, then we can do that. All right, normally I have a time for questions. If there are any, if Cynthia has seen any, that is fabulous. If not, I would direct you to the Savvy Homeschool webpage for any questions that you may have.
No questions, but I'm sure you have given them a lot to think about, because this is a lot of really good material.
Well, it is a lot of information. Trying to squeeze everything in an hour is a little bit challenging, but I appreciate the time, and it was well spent, I believe. And again, you can reach out through the website. And thank you very much for being with me.
Because this was very interesting, and I know that you have studied a lot and you show a lot of finesse. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You take care.
Bye-bye.